So this is part 6 of my reflection, commentary, and dialogue on the Platonic dialogue, the Sophist. So I finished the last part in the middle of a reflective episode, so I'm going to continue it outright here. If anybody is curious about where we have been, check the previous episodes. It turns out that if no beings change, then nothing anywhere possesses any intelligence about anything. But furthermore, if we admit that everything is moving and changing, then on that account we take the very same thing away from those which are. So on one hand we have this idea that if that which is does not change, if certain aspects of that which is do not fall into that which is not, then we would not be able to perceive, or we would not be able to have the capacity of intelligence. And we say that because to know something is to change it, or to have some effect on something. And that, I think, could be kind of difficult to conceptualize immediately. But I think it's important to remember that we ought not to fall too deeply into our own interpretation too quickly, or our own opinion too quickly. We have to follow the logic that exists and build upon it. I'm trying to take, as best as I can, a proverbial approach here. Proverbial in the sense that of the book of Proverbs, each verse is seen as a key to open that door to some fertile substrate. The substrate is not some superstitious or imaginal, well, I suppose to a degree it's imaginal, but it's not false in the sense that these imaginings are there to satisfy our aching heart. At times, I think it may lead to the further progress of such an unfortunate condition. But the point is, we have to develop that landscape through which we can interpret and expand on what we are trying to understand and know. So I want to read this bit again. It turns out that if no beings change, then nothing anywhere possesses any intelligence about anything. And now I want to bring up a couple concepts that have been important. Now I should mention that I just returned from vacation, the first one that I've taken in a while without recording, so there's going to be some time to ramp back up my understanding of where I was. So the first thing that I want to bring up is that which wholly is, the concept of the whole, and we're going to leave that in the background. We also have this idea of knowing, understanding. These concepts are brought to us by some former principle of an active and a passive principle. I've added a male and female relationship in there. That seems to work, at least in my mind. That the masculine is more of the penetrative, changing, and the feminine is more of the accepting and having the change done to it. And we've come off of this conversation in which there is this anxiety about not attributing things that we know to be, that are important to us, like the soul, like intelligence, like thinking. All of these things we are trying to fit within the broad narrative of that which is. And of course, the primary objective here is to go on the hunt for the sophist. And we found ourselves here because of the sophist's arguments. The door exactly that brought us here is uncertain, at least at this moment, but it's not necessary to understand exactly where it was. The point being is that the sophist wrestles here. And if the sophist is to be one that deliberately or inadvertently perverts the minds of the young so that this person can live off of their confusion, then it's important to solve these foundational issues. The foundational issue that we see now is the difference between that which is and that which is not. In some sense, it's a relational issue, relational in the sense that that which is not seems to be a concept that cannot exist, and yet it is something that can be identified. And so the question is, well, how can it be identified if it is nothing? My contention has been that that which is not is subordinate to that which is, but there are many interpretations on how being is and how non-being is. Theaetetus responds to the visitor's claim, absolutely not. Again, it turns out that if no beings change, then nothing anywhere possesses any intelligence about anything. The visitor continues, but furthermore, if we admit that everything is moving and changing, then on that account, we take the very same thing away from those which are. So there's an identity issue here. And I want to mention briefly that there are two classes of people that we're speaking of. The ones that believe in the forms, that true being exists in the formal domain, that it is not necessarily grounded in the physical substrate. They believe in a process of coming to be, but that true being exists within the formal domain. And then you have the other types, the physical types, that believe in forms, I guess, to a degree, but everything that is not tangible is not fully true, let's say. So you have these opposing arguments. So this idea of change and being, how can something that is constantly be in motion, because it would be constantly changing? And how can you maintain an identity through time if it's constantly changing into something that is different? So that which it is also that which it is not. And so I think what we are approaching is necessarily a sort of sophisticated mechanism by which that which is not is nested within an overarching identity. Now what comes to mind here is my own identity. I have certainly changed over time, and yet I have memories, and everything that has happened to me has participated in the identity that is me. And the former aspects of myself that have been shed or forgotten does not mean that my identity is void. I want to read what the visitor's response is one more time. But furthermore, if we admit that everything is moving and changing, then on that account, we take the very same thing away from those which are. Now, I suppose we can take a rather dramatic example. I'm trying to think about a natural example and illustration, the first thing that comes to mind is a river. A river is something that, by its very nature, changes. It has the capacity and the power to erode the landscape that it flows through. And yet mighty rivers generally stay the same, even if they're altered to a degree. And I suppose I should be a bit careful about my language here. When I say the same, there are ways in which there is difference, certainly. But that difference does not rule the river itself, the identity itself, that which is. Now, Theaetetus is curious about this. He responds, why? The visitor asks the question, do you think that without rest anything would be the same, in the same state, in the same respects? So without rest, implying that everything is within motion. Now this idea of motion, I think we have to be a bit careful of, or at least I have to be a bit careful of. In my mind, I tend to think a bit Newtonian, of physical motion. Now, I don't think that's wrong necessarily, but it's a bit limiting in the mental sphere. If we move ourselves back into this proverbial space that I had mentioned, I think it's important to recognize that if we say rest, there's a broader implication than just rolling a ball down the street, for example. So the question is, well, what is the broader implication? And I would say that the broader implication is, with movement, there's a type of sacrifice that because of its motion, and here I think the words are a bit confusing, as I feel as though I can see this concept in a term that is more appropriate, but what is used here is that language. I think there's a degree of the human perspective that's involved here. We can easily imagine a situation in which I can move my hand up, let's say, and I can move it back down. And so there's an instance of motion, and yet the hand is no different than it was. We could say that there is a difference in terms of position, and in the fine-tuned philosophical argument, I suppose there can be some difficulty there. If I move my hand up, now it's in a different state. It's not as it was in the holistic sense of that which is. Similarly, we can imagine the geometry of a particular thing. We don't have to just look at location. So, for example, I could look at the shape of my hand as I move it up, and I could change the shape of it. It can be quite dramatically different in one position versus the other. So here we have two different dimensions. We have the geometry, but we also have position. And so what quickly emerges here, although I'm using a physical analogy, is different dimensions. Different categories through which we can observe and measure the change to some system. And that's important because if we're trying to answer the question of if anything changes, if it doesn't come to rest, then it's important to understand what changes in a situation outside of rest. In the mental domain, I think there are some important differences. Our measurement tools fail us here, and subjective experience takes over. And it can be a bit deceiving, but it's important nonetheless. Now, I mentioned memories. I mentioned that I, as an individual, have changed over time, but yet all the same, I maintain some consistent identity. I think that there are psychological tools by which we can measure where our attention is, where our general disposition is, based on where we are in life, how satisfied we are, how dissatisfied we are. And the mind is an interesting sort of thing. Because unlike my hand, where I could just sort of leave it down at rest, if I were to stop speaking and try to think of nothing, I can accomplish it to a degree, but the mind is always taking in information. The hand is just that one aspect that can provide me with sensory information, but there are so many different joints, so many different muscles and organs that provide me with information. It's almost impossible to completely shut off experience. Now, I can shut off aspects of the self that are very directed, like I can limit thoughts through meditation, for example, and I could be very embodied, and I could be very experiential in that way. But I mention this because the mind, unlike physical objects, is very dynamic, and it could be argued at least, that the mind is always changing, it is always moving, and because it is always moving, it is subject to that change that the visitor speaks of. And yet, given the time that we have here, the past couple minutes or so, there has been no change to my mental state. Now, I can change it depending on the conversation that we speak of. Of late, I've been reflecting on certain failures of capacity that I have, weakness of character. And these sorts of things fill me with a sense of anxiety sometimes, a sense of dread or melancholy. And there's a dispositional rut, I call it dispositional, a rut that I get in every once in a while that is caused by this reflection. And I suppose in a way that this is a psychological dimension through which I measure where I am, where my mind is at. If I am not as concerned about my failures, and I'm just concerned about the productive aspects of life, then I feel better. But sometimes the feeling and the will, the strength, fails me. I'm going to Google quickly disposition. So disposition, the definition is a person's inherent qualities of mind and character. I say that this is accurate to what I was trying to describe. The second definition is the way in which something is placed or arranged, especially in relation to other things. So definitely the word that I wish to use there. So in response to what the visitor says, again, do you think that without rest anything would be the same, in the same state, in the same respects? Theaetetus says, no, not at all. Well then, do you see any case in which intelligence is or comes to be anywhere without these things? These things, I would imagine that he's referring to that which is in motion, that which changes, and that which is at rest, or that which is being changed. Theaetetus responds, not in the least. The visitor follows up and he says, and we need to use every argument we can to fight against anyone who does away with knowledge, understanding, and intelligence, but at the same time asserts anything at all about anything. The visitor comes to a conclusion and he says that the philosopher has to be like a child begging for both, and say that which is everything is both the unchanging and that which changes. So my curiosity here, and it's been this way I think for some time, especially when we think about matters of God and how religion has progressed generally in the Western world. Here I think of the Reformation. I think about the stability of the Church, the Romish Church, the disintegration of the Church, the disintegration of the religion in some respects, the reintegration somehow, in some weak way that we experience now, the curiosity about the future and what is to come of our religious sensibilities. But going back to the point that I made earlier, there has to be this reconciliation between the unchanging and that which changes. And it's not really a matter of having the anxiety about something that's constantly in motion and not being able to identify, or something that just is and doesn't change, and by virtue of it just being, that everything that we know to be doesn't exist. Both of those things seem to be false in our experience. We know that we exist, and maybe I can't make such a claim, but it seems fairly obvious that things exist. And it's fairly obvious that things exist for long enough, at least it seems that's a dimension that's useful, time, such that they can be appreciated and understood. And by understanding, I think we have a lot of philosophical material to build off of there. Now we have a short break, and the visitor goes on to say, "Don't you notice, my young friend, that we're now in extreme ignorance about it? Though it appears to us that we are saying something." Theaetetus responds, "It does to me anyway, but I don't completely understand how we got into this situation without noticing." So I'm going to pause for a second and say, just based on what I'm feeling right now, I think I'm just going to continue in this interpretive manner. Usually I read a couple pages and then go back and interpret them. What I just finished there was the 2 pages that I had read, but I'm going to continue in the way that I had. Some of this might be a bit partial reading, but it's going to be enough to understand. The visitor says, "Then think more clearly about it. Given what we've just agreed to, would it be fair for someone to ask us the same question we earlier asked the people who say that everything is just hot and cold?" "What was it?" says Theaetetus. "Remind me." "Certainly. And I'll try, at any rate, to do it by asking you in just the same way as I asked then, so that we can move forward at the same pace." Now, before we move on, I want to think about what the visitor said here. Where we are as a general anxiety about being in a difficult situation. That we are in extreme ignorance about it. It appears to us that we are saying something about that which is and that which is not, but actually it's probably not much of anything. So we have to determine if where we've come to actually is useful. And so we go back to asking the question about 2 qualities, hot and cold, opposites to one another. But it's kind of a reflection of many things that we've seen already. That of being and non-being, of that which is and that which is not. About physical, tangible being is the only true being, and about non-tangible, form-like information as being the true being of something. Of many and of one. And it would seem that we have passed this stage, that there's a little bit of both in everything. That of hot and cold, I think there's a lot that can be said. Can we say that there's something in between? Can we say that there's something of both? I suppose we can. But it requires something. And I wonder what they will come to say? The visitor says, now then, wouldn't you say that change and rest are completely contrary to each other? Of course, says Theaetetus. And you'd say that both equally are, and that each of them equally is? Yes. When you admit that they are you saying that both and each of them change? Not at all, says Theaetetus. And are you signifying that they rest when you say that they both are? Of course not. So do you conceive that which is as a third thing alongside them which encompasses rest and change? And when you say that they both are you taking the two of them together and focusing on their association with being? Theaetetus responds, it does seem probably true that when we say change and rest are, we do have a kind of omen that which is a third thing. So that which isn't both change and rest, it's something different from them instead? It seems so. So let's pause here for a moment. So the third thing, between the hot and cold, between that which is and that which is not. And maybe between is not the right thing to say. A third thing is interesting. Now the path that we've gone down here is a separation from where we were. If we recall, we had this rigid perspective at the outset, that we have something that changes and then something that is more passive and is at rest. And there is this tension between that which does the changing and then that which is, or that which is static. But here we are moving into a realm of greater sophistication. And we are saying that which changes, or that which is in motion, and that which is at rest, or is having something done to it, both of these are. They both equally are. Each of them equally is. And it's not because that they are subject to change constantly. There's a state of being that is independent of that. And so this sense of that which is the third thing. The visitor says, by its own nature, that which is doesn't either rest or change. I suppose it doesn't, says Theaetetus. Which way should someone turn his thoughts if he wants to establish for himself something clear about it? I don't know, says Theaetetus. I don't think any line is easy. If something isn't changing, how can it not be resting? And how can something not change if it doesn't in any way rest? But now that which is appears to fall outside of both of them. Is that possible? Absolutely not, says Theaetetus. In this connection, we ought to remember the following. When we were asked what we should apply the name that which is not to, we became completely confused. Do you remember? Of course. And now aren't we in just as much confusion about that which is? We seem to be even more confused, if that's possible. The visitor says, then we've now got a complete statement of our confusion. But there's now hope, precisely because both that which is and that which is not are involved in equal confusion. That is, insofar as one of them is clarified, either brightly or dimly, the other will be too. And if we can't see either of them, then anyway we'll push our account of both of them forward as well as we can. Fine, says Theaetetus. Let's give an account of how we call the very same thing, whatever it may be, by several names. What, for instance? Give me an example. Surely we're speaking of a man even when we name him several things. That is, when we apply colors to him and shapes, sizes, defects, and virtues. In these cases, and a million others, we say that he's not only a man, but also is good and indefinitely many different things. And similarly, on the same account, we take a thing to be one, and at the same time, we speak of it as many, by using many names for it. That's true, says Theaetetus. So here they've come around to the idea that we spoke of before, that the man can have many qualities and still maintain a singular identity. He mentions colors, shapes, sizes, defects, virtues, a million things. The visitor says, out of all this we've prepared a feast for young people and for old, late learners. They can grab hold of the handy idea that it's impossible for that which is many to be one, and for that which is one to be many. They evidently enjoy forbidding us to say that a man is good, and only letting us say that that which is good, or that a man is a man. You've often met people, I suppose, who are carried away by things like that. Sometimes they're elderly people who are amazed at this kind of thing, because their understanding is so poor, and they think they've discovered something prodigiously wise. Theaetetus responds, of course. Then let's direct our questions now both to these people and also to the others we were talking with before. That way our account will be addressed to everyone who's ever said anything at all about being. What question do you mean? Shall we refuse to apply being to change or to rest, or anything to anything else? Shall we take these things to be unblended and incapable of having a share in each other in the things we say? Or shall we pull them all together and treat them all as capable of associating with each other? Or shall we say that some can associate and some can't? Which of these options shall we say they choose, Theaetetus? Theaetetus says, I don't know how to answer for them. So I want to work my way through what the visitor had to say here. The first sentence, shall we refuse to apply being to change or to rest, or anything to anything else? Kind of a confusing statement. Again, shall we refuse to apply being to change or to rest, or anything to anything else? And the answer to that would be no. But let's begin with refusing to apply being to change or to rest. Of being, we can say that it is something that exists. Of things that exist, we can say there exists the phenomenon of change and of rest, that particular state. In the state, things will be there. So we shall not refuse by applying being to these particular cases. He says, shall we take these things to be unblended and incapable of having a share in each other in the things we say? And I think here is an important point, because it's been my contention that that which is and that which is not has a close relationship. In fact, for that which is to be maintained, there must be that element of that which is not. And similarly, the ideas of change and rest here, I think, are important, especially as it relates to our earlier struggles with a state of static being that is at rest, and a state of change that constantly is unfolding and shifting into what might be considered as a new identity. But while it does so, that confusion that we had about losing the identity in the process, of it not being anymore. And of course, what we're getting at here is something a little bit more sophisticated. That just because something is at rest doesn't mean that it's not subject to change. And just because something at rest undergoes some change doesn't mean that the qualities that it had when it was at rest are now completely destroyed. There's this interrelatedness among the two. Of change, we can say that there is a change, surely, but the change might be superficial. It might not really affect the fundamental underlying principal qualities of the object. Take, for example, the penny. I've used this before. I can move it. Positionally now it's changed, but the identity of the object is the same. I can paint it, but it'll still be a penny. It'll still have its identity. Now I can crush it. Now we wouldn't necessarily call it a penny, but we can understand what its former identity was because of the dramatic change that it, well, maybe not because of the dramatic change that it went through, but because of its form after the change, we can probably identify what had happened to it. I think of those machines in the amusement parks where you can put in the coin and then you press it into whatever symbol that the machine has, and that changes the identity of it. You can no longer use the penny, its purpose changes, but all the same, if you took it and you gave it to somebody else and asked the question, what was this before it was this thing, a penny would not be a far off answer. And that's because there are certain qualities like weight, relative size, color, smell, that still maintain despite the change that had occurred. And again, this seems, in both of these cases, one is a change of small magnitude and one is a change of large magnitude. The larger the magnitude of change, the less it would seem of the principles that are maintained. But it's not in every case. Well, I could say that it is in every case given a particular distinction, and that is to say, it doesn't matter the degree of change in terms of its location or the distance that it has traveled, because that doesn't affect the underlying principles of the identity, the foundational structure of the identity. But there are dimensions that do affect the underlying principal identity of something. And in those dimensions, the scale of change really matters. Shall we pull them all together and treat them as all as capable of associating with each other? Now this question I have to think about a little bit more. Now what is meant by all? Them all together. Now by all, at least from what we had spoken about the previous question, I think it has to do with, and also what the visitor mentioned about the man, identifying the man as having the various applications of shapes, sizes, defects, and virtues, of all of those qualities, of the things that are, which are infinite, millions, billions, and of the things that are not. The opposites of all of those things that are attributed to the man or of this penny. Can we pull all of them together and make them capable of associating? I think we can, as a matter of degree. Opposites, of course, have to associate For something to be, it must have its opposite, its contrast. This penny is circular. I'm not sure what the opposite of this circularness is, but any other shape it could be contrasted to. We can say that it has weight to it instead of no weight, that it is shiny as opposed to non-reflective. There are many things that we can say about it, and there are associations with these things. The associations help maintain the identity of the object relative to other things, to other coins, but also to objects that are quite dissimilar to it. The last question, or maybe not the last question, but, or shall we say that some can associate and some can't? This is a harder one, I think. Are there things about this coin that are, while there are things that are, that which is, and also of the things that which is not, can all be centered into it? And I'd say no, they cannot be. But here, I would have to work on this a little bit more, and I'm curious what they have to say. Because the coin participates in something that is greater. It is because of the greaterness that affords it its participation. But I cannot pool absence of the coin in with the coin. I could say that there's a relationship. I suppose there is an association if there's a relationship. I will resume this line of thinking tomorrow, after work. So here we are. A day has passed since the last recording. It is the evening after work, and I find myself ready to explore again. So we left off with asking Theaetetus the question, which one shall we choose? Out of these different options relating to change and rest. I'll read it again just so we can have a refresher. Shall we refuse to apply being to change or to rest, or anything to anything else? Shall we take these things to be unblended and incapable of having a share of each other in the things we say? Or shall we pull them all together and treat them all as capable of associating with each other? Or shall we say that some can associate and some can't? Which of these options shall we say they choose, Theaetetus? And to this he says, I don't know how to answer for them. So the visitor responds, why don't you reply to the options one by one, thinking about what results from each of them? Fine, says Theaetetus. First, if you like, let's take them to say that nothing has any capacity at all for associating with anything. Then change and rest won't have any share in being. So I find it to be quite the statement to say that nothing has any capacity at all for association with anything. So if we go back to our definition of the word capacity, from the Middle English we have volume, ability, capability. From the Old French we have ability, size, competence. From the Latin we have ability, capability, breadth, fullness, capable of holding much, spacious, to take, hold, and seize. So this potential, this ability to act and to modify, to change, This is quite fundamental. There's no doubt about that. And what's interesting about a statement that is so simple and yet so broad in the sense that it doesn't take very many words to identify a concept, but the concept itself is fundamental, and by its fundamentality, even if it's incorrect, we have to go to a place where we reflect on the foundations of something that it supports. What it supports is quite large. If all that there is something that we are considering, and we're considering the foundations of that thing, then the implications surely are quite large. And so, if one is to say that nothing has any capacity at all for association with anything, it takes a moment. The concept of nothingness is this: buzzing bee, the gnat that flies in the ear, or the mosquito that bites the leg. It is this annoying presence. But just because it's annoying doesn't mean that it should not occupy our attention. Nothing is something that is part of our experience. It has an identity. There are plenty of layers of understanding for which we use absence or nothingness to describe something. While in the absolute sense this may not be true, the way in which we use it, that is. For if we are asked the question, what is on your mind, and we say nothing, of course that is not true. The mind is broader than just thoughts. There are feelings, and that there is information that is being processed. There's a particular meaning that we have when we say nothing. We don't generally mean true nothingness when we are asked that question. Or we say, what is in your hand, and we say nothing. Is that true? I suppose in a way it is, yes. In the purposeful sense, yes. It satisfies all of the components of the question. There's no physical object in my hand. I think we can also ask about the quality of inness in that respect, especially if the hand is open. But the hand is not in a space of nothing, let's say. There are things beyond that which the sight can see that occupy that space. We can ask questions about what is between material things. If we occupy the space in between that, is that something that we consider nothing? Must it be within this physical space that we find nothingness? Let's take them to say that nothing has any capacity at all for association with anything. My first question is, how can this be the case? If everything that I have just described, the way in which the human being uses nothing to associate with it, or perhaps the way that an animal uses nothingness to associate with prey or a predator or kin, in the sense that the mind is looking, let's say in the case of a deer, for example, when it looks up after it grazes, it believes that it has heard something, and it is watching for any potential sign that it may be in danger. If it sees nothing, then it resumes its previous task. There's a clear association between the behavior and the nothingness that it identifies, the absence of the potentially injurious agent. Even if the agent is present but hidden, and the perception is that it is absent, it is still a part of that associated landscape. Furthermore, I have this desire to think about a way in which the contrary may also be true. And the funny thing is that I find myself being drawn into this nothingness. I feel like I'm being associated with this nothingness as I attempt to find the contrary position. Now that may not necessarily make sense, but I mean to say that when I consider this nothingness, or when I consider absence, whichever word, I use them interchangeably, I find myself thinking about its definition, about its lacking of something, that it has this conceptual body to it, but it's held in the conceptual sphere to identify that which is true relative to certain situations. And that just because we are saying that there is something absent doesn't necessarily mean that we have to take its absence, or we have to take absence in general, as a causative thing. But here again, I find myself thinking about the association. Because the causative thing is associated to nothingness. Again, I go back to the expression of the deer in the woods, feeding on whatever it's feeding on. That association against its fear is the thing that pacifies it. Although nothingness by itself would not be sufficient, that there has to be this concern for something else. And the question is, well, does this mean that nothingness lacks capacity? And is it only the fear that produces the capacity? And I have difficulty saying. It seems like the two must be related to each other. Let's try to use one more example, an example that is not of a living organism. Let's take a piece of matter. Let's say a piece of matter that is unseen. Within my hand right now, there are many particles. There are many elements. These elements have various properties that I'm unaware of because I cannot see them. I suppose I can identify them somehow, but that being aside, these things that I cannot perceive, but I know that they are there because we are able to measure them. We are able to identify them. This already presents with that confusing situation in which I can call what is in my hand nothing, but also at the same time I can't. Now, tangibly, I cannot feel what is in my hands, but I know there is something there because of an extension of mind, through some apparatus, some tool of measure. And I can easily prove to myself that there is something here. A balloon is a good example of this. I can create pressure, and that pressure is something that I blow into the balloon with these invisible particles. And together their volume, their compactness, creates this pressure that is bound within this structure that has a barrier to it that does not allow them to pass through. So this surface level meaning of nothingness applies, but it applies at a particular level of observation. That's the first thing. And then the second thing is that I mentioned that I wanted to explore this outside of the biological. So let's remove, as best we can, the observational argument. is it possible to identify nothingness without an observer? Now, if I'm not here, or if I think about the other room, for example, I know that there will be a space in there that is not occupied by visible objects, that is also occupied by the element oxygen, or carbon dioxide. Now, I make that assumption based on some reason. I could probably figure out some way to prove that this is true. If it is true that something exists, and it is something that is existing beyond my perception, fine. Like I said, my perception doesn't matter so much in this protracted example. But thinking about the other room, somewhere that I'm not physically in, that has various things interacting with one another, at the level of the element, what is it? Can we say the role of nothingness? In this world, we have material that is not conscious in the sense that we are. Certainly they participate in things that are much greater than themselves. They come together. They move apart. But they don't have the fear. They don't have the desire. But they do have those properties through which they, although they are not sophisticated enough to give us the idea, or to have them have an idea of why they do as they do. It is just a matter of doing because of capacity. But within their capacity, I think the reflection also holds that there are many things that something can be capable of, but does not do because it's outside of its capacity. And this inside and outside dynamic, regardless of the observer, I think is something that stays constant. For one thing is an identity. One thing may change into another. And like I mentioned earlier, it may maintain elements of its identity, like carbon dioxide, for example. There's oxygen in it, but there's also carbon. But it is something different than just oxygen. The process of change occurs here just as it does in my mind, just as it does in my psychological and physical development. And in the process of change, surely there is this sense of absence. If something is to change from one state of identity to another, something that was has gone to a state of that which is not, or a state of nothingness. Regardless of the remnants of the identity that is still held in carbon dioxide, that is not within oxygen, for example. If we examine the two states, there is a sense of nothingness that occurs because of this change. That in the state of carbon dioxide, the singularity of and the oneness of the oxygen is no more. And it is by this association of change and difference to that which is no longer, or that which is not, that I think, at least at the smallest level, we can say that nothing exists. But it exists in the context of a broader interaction among things. And by its interaction, it has association. and by its association it has capacity. Nothing has any capacity at all for association with anything. Then change and rest won't have any share in being. And this is true, if the previous assertion is true. Theaetetus responds, no, they won't. Well then, says the visitor, will either of them be, if they have no association with being? Theaetetus responds, no. It seems that agreeing to that destroys everything right away, both for the people who make everything change, for the ones who make everything an unchanging unit, and for the ones who say that beings are forms that always stay the same and in the same state. All of these people apply being. Some do it when they say that things really are changing, and others do it when they say that things really are at rest. So for the sake of consistency, but perhaps sacrificing expediency, I do want to think about this a little bit, even though it's fairly straightforward what the visitor has to say here. And we established how it may not be the case. For the people who make everything change, again, I want to think about what the implications of that might be. Again, our initial argument, the difficulty that I had with that was not so much that change exists, because of course change exists, but rather that everything is in a state of change. And even that doesn't satisfy, because everything is in a state of change in a sense. But maybe there's a way in which I could say that it is not. I think there's always an alteration of thingness taking place. And by that we could say that there is change. But we cannot say it to the degree that identity cannot exist. Because of course identity must exist. If identity must exist, then I should say, there must be some dimension by which the identity can exist, or I should say there must be some way to measure how that identity exists, and so we can find a property, and then we can find a slice of time, let's say, for which the identity is stable and can be identified. There's another way of putting that, so we can move outside of the observer, and we can say that there must be a way of being outside of the principle of change, such that being is possible. And then I suppose we can make the argument, well, if everything does change to a degree, then at what scale does it matter that an identity may exist for a short period of time? Does time matter at all? If I look out the window, I see, it happens to be late at night. I want to paint this picture. It's late at night, and I see a Benny's Beverage Depot across the street. I happen to live in a condo building. Part of the building is on a residential neighborhood. The other is on a busy street. On the other side of the street is a commercial real estate. And there happens to be a supermarket on the other side of Benny's, but also the Benny's with its empty parking lot and its red sign illuminated that is shining through my window. It's kind of interesting, the scenery here. It's a clear night. There happens to be a museum actually right outside my window. a historical museum with a flag that is lit up by a light and a great big tree by this museum. So this interesting contrast of different things that I can see out my window. All of these things remain fairly stationary and static. I know at some point all of it will change. All of it will succumb to the forces of nature. And the various underlying components of these things will participate in other identities at some point. But if it were the case that change was such a pernicious demon as to deny identity at all, then change would be such a thing that would have such a strong association with absence or nothingness that I would say that it is nothingness. Because it is in such a way that denies being, it denies identity, it denies stability of thingness. If the foundations of thingness are denied or changed so rapidly that something cannot be, then you have no being, then it is nothing. So of course, even though we can say that change occurs to all things, it does not do so in a way to destroy all things, only to modify. It is something that serves that which is. For the ones who make everything an unchanging unit. So now we have the opposite situation, where again before we had the situation in which identity cannot exist, and therefore thingness cannot exist because of this self-destructive, this sort of black hole experience that takes everything in on itself to establish nothing in its place. Now we have something that is, but cannot associate. It is unchanging. And I think, now I mentioned it cannot associate, and I think that there's a direct relationship between that which cannot change and that which associates. So there's an implication that association implies change. And if change is to be moving from one state to another, if this is to hold, if this is to be a principle that stays, it must be something that applies or that is constant throughout all examples. So I'm holding in my hand a pen. And this pen is something that, for the moment, is unchanging. But just because, like with Binny's across the street, for the moment it is unchanging, doesn't mean that it will never change. And it doesn't mean it is an item that is subject to an unchanging disposition, full stop. Now, if this object was truly one of these things, an unchanging unit, I would not be able to interact with it. I would not be able to associate with it. I would not be able to manipulate it, to move its position, to change its speed, and I think even to identify its color or its shape. Now, why do I say that? Now I test for a moment my understanding of physics here. But there's an association that this pen plays with the reality that is around it. And that if it was unchanging, as soon as the light from my reading lamp hit it, there would be no effect. It would not reflect back to me. And here I have to use artificial intelligence to help me with the physical explanation. This requires change. For photons to leave the pen and reach my eyes, the pen must be part of a system of energy exchange. If the pen were an absolutely unchanging unit, it would, not reflect light, because reflection requires interaction with incoming light waves, not transmit any causal signals, and therefore not appear at all. Thus perceivability presupposes physical responsiveness. The pen is not a static object. It is visibly present because it enters into causal interactions. It is touchable because it yields and resists force. It is knowable because it presents itself in parts over time. So the next thing that the visitor says is for the ones who say that beings are forms that always stay the same and in the same state. Now I wonder at my previous reflection. And I wonder at it because given the expression for the ones who make everything an unchanging unit, I seem to have interpreted it as or saw it from a perspective as everything having the possibility of being an unchanging unit, even something as small as a pen, but it wouldn't make sense, especially after the conclusion that I had come to. Now everything and unit would imply that there is this identity of the whole that each particular item within the whole plays a role in. And I think, although my interpretation may have been a little off on that previous part or phrase, I think that the reasoning still stands if we think about it in terms of the one. It's a difficult thing, though, and I'll try to be brief here so we can move on again to that next statement, but it's a difficult thing because I've heard somebody say before that God is neither, or God is both, that which is and that which is not. And I found it to be such a difficult thing, especially in light of my own opinion, that that which is not is subject to that which is. Or we could say it differently, being and non-being. God is both being and non-being at the same time. Again, I have difficulty finding the reason to say that non-being would be ever above being. Perhaps they share in this tandem relationship, some reciprocal relationship, that it's not a matter of submitting, nor is it a matter of directing or ruling over with regard to these two principles, but again, rather their harmonious interaction. But again, I'll say that the reasoning stands for the one. Much like the singular, if the one is to be completely unchanging, I suppose we can reason that its parts may be changing, but the parts would only change to maintain a fixed identity, which ultimately means that the variability that occurs at the small level ultimately has no meaning, because it doesn't occupy anything different. It is ultimately determined and fixed, occupying the same principles. And I think there are various ways that one can come to understand this. If they believe that thingness is from nothingness, or thingness is from thingness, it doesn't really matter. The concept of unifying on an unchanging identity is something that is sure to be, I want to say, impossible for some of the reasons that I've mentioned. Again, a fixed identity although there may be variability, is ultimately determinate, and by its determinacy, it reduces meaning. And its identity itself. I have to imagine, and perhaps I'm speaking a little bit too loosely here, but I have to imagine that its own identity would be unsustainable in such a state. Because the parts within itself, despite the necessity for that requirement for some stable principle of identity, if the principles themselves maintained complete independence from one another and had no relation at all, then it's impossible that they would be included on one identity. They would fall into themselves. It's a purely hypothetical situation. I don't think it's a stable reality. So let's move on to the next statement. Spend some more time on it there. For the ones who say that beings are forms that always stay the same and in the same state. So let's try, perhaps with the use of our artificial intelligence friend here, to define the form in the Platonic sense. My general understanding of this form is that it can be a perfect representation of something. It might not exist in physical form. It may only exist in mind. Much like a perfect circle, for example. It would be quite difficult to find a perfect circle in nature, but we can mathematically find one, and we can produce one. And we could bring it down to the physical level and produce a fairly perfect circle, with many different materials and objects, whatever. Now this is my definition, but if I read the artificial intelligence explanation, Plato's theory of forms, defined as the forms, Greek for idea, are eternal, unchanging, immaterial essences or patterns of which the sensible, material world is only an imperfect and perishable copy. They are the truest reality, objects of the intellect, and not of the senses, and are the only things that can be truly known. They are, again, immutable and eternal, the explanation of this being, forms do not change, perish, or come into being. They are always what they are. Non-physical. They are not located in space or time. They cannot be touched or seen by the senses. Universals. Each form is the one true instance of a thing. An example is beauty itself, and not just a beautiful object. We have the causes of particulars. Particular things participate in or imitate forms. A beautiful flower is beautiful because it partakes in the form of beauty. Objects of knowledge. Only forms can be truly known. Sensible things are in flux, and thus only objects of opinion, not knowledge. Hierarchical. Some forms are more fundamental than others. The form of the good is supreme, the source of all order, intelligibility, and reality. So we can see from this how this would divert from my own current belief about things being fixed. It still remains to me a difficult question of identity and its changing nature, but also of its stability. But be that as it may, let's continue. So again, with the forms in mind, there are people that say that beings are forms. An interesting idea that of everything there's a perfect representation of itself. I have to wonder about that. Like the pen, for example, participates in the perfect pen. Perhaps it participates in its purpose of penness. I myself, a human being, an independent agent, has a good side of myself, the good side that flows through this experience, and a negative side. Both of these can be a form, let's say, that can be identified, perfected in its definition. But I wonder, what I see in front of me is this layered participation. That if I think of myself as good, or elements of myself as good, that goodness participates in the form of goodness. It doesn't participate in me, let's say. I participate in that form. But along the way to that, there's the aspect of me through which goodness may flow. And there is that perhaps idyllic, perceptual, or intellectual idea of that goodness of who I am as an independent being. So that idea by itself, this layered participation, the nestedness, I think there's some usefulness in that. But when it comes to that the forms stay the same and in the same state, then the previous reasoning comes into play. And there's something still here that I am uncertain about. And this has to do with the highest level of participation and about the nature of unchangingness. I mentioned the principles earlier that are maintained to maintain some sort of identity. And that change on fundamental enough of a scale will disrupt the identity of something such that it can no longer be remembered or identified under the purposes that it once held. Now, it would be quite difficult to imagine such a situation in a human being. There are situations that come close, like in a situation of complete amnesia, or perhaps a combination between amnesia and a dramatic disfigurement, which the being is radically altered, but still the underlying neural network of mind is still there. And so there is a constancy of being in that sense. A bit grounded more so in that material of mind, but all the same, I struggle with the idea of something that is unchanging. Now, everything that is subject to change is also not something that can be sustainable. As I've mentioned earlier in that first expression, for the people who make everything change, it's unstable. An unstable identity unwinds itself into nothingness. There seems to be an operable range in here that hopefully will come out in the future, at least some idea of how there is this marriage between being and non-being. all of these people apply being. Some do it when they say that things really are changing, and others do it when they say that things are really at rest, or staying the same. Theaetetus responds, absolutely. The visitor continues, also there are people who put everything together at one time and divide them at another. Some put them together into one and divide them into indefinitely many, and others divide them into a finite number of elements and put them back together out of them. None of these people, regardless of whether they take this to happen in stages or continuously, would be saying anything if there isn't any blending. And to this, Theaetetus responds, right. So let's go over this paragraph and think about it a little bit. Also, there are people who put everything together at one time and divide them at another. So from a practical standpoint, or maybe from an individual standpoint, I'm curious at how I may use this in my life. I'm curious at what type of person I am. How do I go about seeing reality, seeing life? People who put everything together at one time and divide them at another. So the concept of unification and division are fundamental. And as I've mentioned earlier, when we get to these fundamental levels, it's almost difficult to understand exactly where to go, because there's probably so many different ways in which we can use the concepts of division and of unification. But if I had to center my mind for a moment to just think about a personal experience, and here I'm a bit distracted because I recognize the dangers of personal experience, but using personal experience and staying reasonable, I think, is manageable given a sophisticated enough reflection. And all the same, I think it's necessary, because if we don't understand how we are in the world, then that would make for a difficult religious life. Understanding the self is an important thing, both to understand the dangers of the self, but also the beauties of it, the potential of it. So the people who put everything together at one time. So when might one do this in life? I think about work. I think about the unification of information onto a target, let's say. This is particularly useful in the scientific process. That we have some idea, we gather information to form some hypothesis, we design a plan and execute on the curiosities that are within the hypothesis, and the results that we gather will either support or refute our initial contention. And in this way, we can see a few different possibilities or points through which this process of unification and division or difference can take place. The first one is, of course, the gathering of information into one place, and then the formation of the hypothesis. This is, I think, a process of unification. What follows is the curiosity about the reasonableness or the truth of that unification, which is another interesting reflection, I suppose. The truth of a particular unification that seems to imply that, through mind, there is the possibility of being incorrect. And so we have to have this measured, structured process by which we can mitigate the dangers of that. Understanding what is true is important to our interaction in the world. And so within the very process of coming to understand that which is true, we wish to identify, not to deny the existence of unification, but to be intensely curious about the truth of unification. And we fall into difference or into division, at least in this context, when it is necessary to refute something that we initially had thought to be true, or were proposing as something that would possibly be true. But there are probably almost an infinite number of ways in which we unify and separate things throughout the day, rather implicitly. I think sometimes we wish to unify because we desire some end. And perhaps I could say the same of some difference. We may separate or divide things to make sense of them or to produce some end. So I don't want to dwell too much on the multitude of ways in which we would use difference and unification. But it's an interesting thing just to stop and to think about and to examine how fundamental it is. He continues and he says, some put them together into one and divide them into indefinitely many. And others divide them into a finite number of elements and put them back together out of them. Now this is an interesting extension. This is a thought experiment that carries us a little bit farther. Some put them together into one and divide them into indefinitely many. I like to take another example, a simple one. Some put them together into one. Recently, I was given this metal pen container. I think I was a little bit more excited than I should have for receiving such a trivial object, but I sort of needed one. I needed one at my desk, so I put all my pens in. In that experience of gathering all my pens, I'm putting everything into one place. I'm unifying all of these separate pieces, because I know that it would be useful to have them all together. But I divide them if I want to utilize its function or its purpose, and that is to write something. Now, it doesn't mean that this process of unifying things and separating things is a fixed thing, that it always must be this way, but it's just another example of one possibility. Now, there's an extension on this distinction, because it's not necessarily saying a unification and difference of just one part. It's infinitely many parts. Now, this is something that I do not do with my pen. I don't crush it with a hammer and then continue to try and separate the elements farther and farther and farther until what? I don't know. Until I've tried to find something of absence. I don't know what the end of that is. But the destruction of identity for certain. But one important detour I think that we need to take is to understand the concept of the indefinite. Initially, I wanted to speak on infinite, but I did some thinking and some research, and it seems that that which is indefinitely many and that which is infinite is not exactly the same thing. Some people put them together into one and divide them into indefinitely many. So the first thing that I want to go to, something that I have to come back to again to re-energize the mind, is what we are speaking of when we say them. When I think about this, when I think them, I think of thingness in general. I think of being. A principle so fundamental. So I suppose we can take the essence. And here I think about the difference between infinity and indefinite. Indefinite is more of a procedure, something that is ongoing and a potential, whereas infinite is something that is completed and actual. And infinity may refer to the actual being or totality, whereas indefinite describes a process or method. An example of an infinity, set of all natural numbers, and indefinitely many, the procedure by which you count forever all of those natural numbers. And when I think of thingness, when I think of them being, I think of the indefinite. Of course, we're speaking of the indefinite here in our dialogue. Some put them together into one and divide them into indefinitely many. Now, thingness itself can be thought of like an infinity, but also it can be thought of like that sort of first-hand participation, procedural thing, something that we can participate in. It's almost an exhausting sort of thing to ground the mind on this concept, but I can choose literally anything. I can grab a coin, I can grab my book, I can go outside, I can grab a leaf, I can grab a blade of grass or a piece of broken concrete. There are so many things out there, and it seems much like infinity, the concept of thingness itself, the totality, the oneness, that this concept can be contrasted with our first-hand experience about the various parts, the various things that occupy the concept of the whole. Some put them together into one and divide them into indefinitely many. I suppose, just from a personal standpoint, it depends on the day, how I see things. Certainly, there are times just in thinking about this, and times throughout the day where I think holistically. I think in a more completed sense, in an actual sense, about the way something is. I may think about the business versus my role in the business. I may think about God as opposed to myself as an individual. And it seems that when something becomes necessary to participate in the whole, let's say, then it's not as though the thought of the completed or the actual goes away, but it's that I realize that I must participate in this ongoing potential experience. And it's when the call to action is necessitated that perhaps I feel this mode of breaking apart, dividing into indefinitely many, becomes more present. And others divide them into a finite number of elements and put them back together out of them. Again, the goal here is to try to establish exactly what this might mean, and I struggle a little bit. Remembering that this them refers to thingness in general, I have to be a bit careful not to attribute that absoluteness to them, but it is also a possibility to attribute it to them. The others divide them into a finite number. Now, something that is finite is something that has a boundary around it. And indefinite implies no definite end, but a definite implies, again, a boundary. There is a barrier, there is a set. 1 through 5, for example. Now, of course, we can either do this in the sense that we may identify things in life or in nature such that they occupy a finite part of our mind. And perhaps we might do this because it is prudent to do so. Maybe we cannot focus if we did not set these parameters for the mind to follow. The world is a big place. The mind is a big place. Attention is a difficult thing. There are many reasons why one might see the world in this way. But then we can think about it the other way. The individual that might take a boundary to the totality and say, I understand, or maybe not I understand, but I can reduce all that there is to these things, these finite elements or these finite principles, and I don't need any more to explain it. I don't need the infinite, I don't need the indefinite. I just need the concept of these principles, and wherever I am, even in my lack of understanding, I can understand. It's much easier to have a finite number, a finite set, let's say 1 through 5, even if they're quite broad principles. I find how they manifest in the small, in the things, in the penny that I hold in my hand. And then I bring things together such that I can, again, understand them, conceptualize them. None of these people, says the visitor, regardless of whether they take this to happen in stages or continuously, would be saying anything if there isn't any blending. So I think that the visitor is hinting at or pointing at something that we just mentioned. Regardless of whether they take this to happen in stages or continuously. Now, continuously, we can speak about these differently in terms of the different types of people that he had mentioned, but just of the one that is previous, thinking about it continuously, I think, is that principled set that rules reality. And the happening in stages is perhaps more of the indefinite, something that regardless of what we don't understand, we take it step by step. We don't start from a place of principle. Maybe we end there. It's difficult to say exactly. They would be saying, none of these people would be saying anything if there wasn't, or if there isn't any blending. Blending between that which is and that which is not, I think, fundamentally. Or between change and rest. Or between being and non-being. The visitor continues, he says, but furthermore, the most ridiculous account is the one that's adopted by the people who won't allow anything to be called by a name that it gets by association with something else. Again, but furthermore, the most ridiculous account is the one that's adopted by the people who won't allow anything to be called by a name that it gets by association with something else. Now this is, I think, a spin on something that we've seen earlier, a theme that we've seen earlier. This is the failure to recognize the relationality among things, the sort of network potential of identity, of thingness, of being. in the sense that everything that is not entirely definite. Identity can be identified, but it is something that must be porous in order to maintain itself. The concept of change cannot be completely barred, otherwise it'll be asphyxiated by its own being, let's say. Now, what do I mean by that? Asphyxiated by its own being. Well, I take something and I contrast it to that which it is not. If there is nothing that it is not, then it is the only thing. If it is the only thing, then there is not that procedure or that process by which something ends or something ceases. The identity now becomes that which is. I suppose we move to a smaller category, we move inside of this thing, that the thing is now to be seen as the whole, but we can still, by previous example, by previous mindset perhaps, break these things down into simple principles, into simple elements, into an indefinite set of things. Now, I may be far afield here by saying that of something that is, if it is the only thing that is, when we find ourselves within it, as is necessary, because thinking outside of it would not make any sense. I'm thinking about the penny that I have in my hand. If the entire reality was this penny, the agent would not be able to think outside of it. I would not be able to think outside of it. I would participate in it, in its being. As soon as I participated outside of its being, something has changed. I would become something different. The people who won't allow anything to be called by a name that gets its association with something else. In effect, anything that changes is barred from its own identity, and it restricts that which is. Perhaps it's to a concept that says that the initial thing that gave birth to relation is the only thing that is. And if we are to say that in order to name something is to identify it and thereby recognize its identity, these people are in effect saying that everything that has come from something fundamental cannot be called its own thing because it is a part of that thing. It is a part of the original identity. So if we go back to the penny, for example, we expand it to be the entire reality of everything. And I myself, the agent, find myself participating within it somehow, within its structure somewhere. And since I am part of the penny, I don't have a name. I don't have an identity. Even though I'm obviously separate, I am an identity. I can't really understand the entirety of what I participate in at this moment. Even though we're conceptualizing the reality as this penny, it's easy because I can see it now. But nonetheless, I still occupy that space within it, let's say. And it wouldn't really make much sense to deny identity because of its relationship to a broader identity. Now, Theaetetus is curious about this. He says, why? Why is this the case? The Vizier says they're forced to use being about everything. and also separate from others of itself, and a million other things. They are powerless to keep from doing it, that is, from linking them together in their speech, so they don't need other people to refute them, but have an enemy within, and as people say, to contradict them, and they go carrying him around talking in an undertone inside of them like the strange ventriloquist Eurycles. So let's interpret this paragraph by walking our way backwards, starting with the ventriloquist. Let's think about what the ventriloquist does. The ventriloquist is somebody that gives his own voice to something else, to a puppet, let's say. He imagines himself an extension into a new body. But of course, the new body is not something that is or exists, let's say. It is him, but by deception, he wishes to convince that his meaning, the words that come from his mouth are coming from somewhere else. But of course, if they come from him, they can't come from anywhere else. So that last line, so they don't need other people to refute them, but have an enemy within, as people say, to contradict them. And they go carrying him around, talking in an undertone inside them, like the strange ventriloquist. So that last line, and they go carrying him around, talking in an undertone inside them. Going to the first sentence, they are forced to use being about everything. What can we say of this? Forced to use being about everything. This statement is not something that we have encountered, I think. Well, maybe it has, but this is a strange thing to encounter in this context. They are forced to use being about everything. Forced to use being as opposed to non-being, of course. Now, if being is all that there is, then there is no change. Everything is static. If everything is static, then new identities cannot form. If new identities cannot form, new relations cannot form. And in fact, if identity is completely static, then no relations have formed at all. That which is and will not be anything more or less than that which is. It would make all things impossible, all qualities impossible. Motion, contrasting colors and weights, all of this would be impossible. But they're forced to recognize both being and separation, two things that are fundamental. But in this particular school, it would not happen. You cannot separate that which is. Otherwise, it would change it. It would change its identity. And also separate from others of itself. So we can see the contradiction in there. Separate from others of itself. It's very difficult to conceptualize. If I was to take a group of pennies, for example, or a group of coins, let's take, excuse the noise, this might be a little sharp in the microphone, but I'm going to create for myself a group. Okay, well, I guess a dime has found its way in there, but we'll use it, pretend it's a penny. Maybe the dime is useful, because once the dime separates from the group, it is something different. It is a different group in and of itself. So now we have something that has separated from others, but is separated from itself because it was at one time one being. And if it is to maintain that beingness, perhaps it, in some hierarchy we can think of it as maintaining the same or some shared sense of being, but in another way, at this level that I see it, the dime is obviously something that is an entirely separate category. It no longer is the whole of what was. And they're powerless to keep from calling this separation oneness or beingness, I have to imagine. So they contradict themselves. Theaetetus says that's a very accurate comparison. Well then, says the visitor, what if we admit that everything has the capacity to associate with everything else? Theaetetus says, I can solve that one. How? Says the visitor. Because if change and rest belong to each other, then change would be completely at rest, and conversely rest itself would be changing. So let's try and see if what Theaetetus said here makes sense. The visitor initially said, what if we admit that everything has the capacity to associate with everything else? Now in life, we can ask the question, is this true? I suppose the answer is no, in a way. I cannot associate, well, I was about to say that I cannot associate with the president, but of course I can in some way. I can find myself in a position to do so. The probability is low, but it doesn't mean it's impossible. The capacity is there. Now, I could say that in time, I cannot associate with somebody that has died. For example, at the present moment, there are family members that I have lost that I cannot communicate with physically. And I would say that that's a true statement. But we can also say that because of their absence, we can say that they have fallen into non-being, or they participate in a different identity. So that they-ness that I am searching for, the thingness that I am searching for, is now something that I cannot identify in the same way. It has a new name. Now I can come up with a million examples, I suppose. But I don't wish to get lost here. I want to move on to what Theaetetus says. Because if change and rest belong to each other. So let's think about this belonging. Belonging, I think we can say, is a type of association. I can ask myself the question, where do I belong? I could say that I belong to where my duties rest. I belong in a particular occupation. Where do I belong at the moment? It is right here, reading the Sophist. Where do I belong tomorrow in the morning, at 9:30 in the morning, let's say, whereas 9:30 p.m. right now? I belong at work. I belong doing what I must do. So if there's this obligation, by its obligation, that association, they have the obligation to intermingle with one another and to bestow on each other their own graces, their purposes, the purpose of change and the purpose of rest in harmony together. But does that mean that change would be completely at rest and rest would be constantly changing? I don't think so, because then the concepts lose their identity. They must maintain their identity as they dance together. The visitor says, but I suppose it's ruled out by very strict necessity that change should be at rest, and that rest should be change. Theaetetus says, of course. So the third option is the only one left. Theaetetus says yes. So, at the potential risk of having this episode go too long, I think it's best that I finish this episode here with this little cliffhanger. And I'll continue part 7 next time.